Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Sony 28mm f2 prime lens. Now, in my opinion, this is either one of Sony's worst lenses or it's one of its most underrated lenses. Now, the reason I'm torn between those two things is because it's really good at what it's good at, but for $450, it's got some major issues too. Now, $450 is not exactly an expensive lens by any means, nothing compared to a lot of their G Master Glass and a lot of their other lenses. But at $450, it's not exactly a cheap lens either. So today I'd like to talk to you about how it is useful and put it through some of its paces to see if it's really worth the money and whether or not it belongs in your kit. So first, let's just go over the build quality really quick. There's really not too much to it. It does feel really nice in the hand. It's got a nice metal lens mount. It does not have any rubber gaskets, so it is not weather sealed. The only feature on it is the focus ring. It is focused by wire, but the focus ring is really nice and smooth, and the lens itself feels pretty well built. So no complaints there, except for I would really like to see an autofocus manual focus switch on it. It only takes a few extra seconds to go into the camera menus to switch it to manual focus, but it just would be really convenient if it just had that switch right on the lens. So then in terms of general usability, this lens's size is one of its biggest advantages. It's by no means a pancake lens, but it is still pretty nice and compact, and it's only about 7 ounces or 200 grams. Then for comparison's sake, here it is next to Sony's 50mm 1.8, their Nifty 50, and here it is next to the Sony Zeiss 35mm 1.4, and here's really where you can start to see a size advantage, especially because these are somewhat similar focal lengths, and this one only has one stop better aperture. And let's just pop it on a full frame body really quick. And you can see how nice and compact this is. One of the reasons that I really like using this lens is for gimbal work or for travel photography. If you really just want to take one lens and you're not necessarily worried about the sharpest lens or some of the other issues we'll go over in a second, this is really great for just travel snapshots. You want something a little bit better than your phone, then this lens on a full frame or even an APS-C body is going to get you some really great results. So now let's set up some test shots and go over some of the things that I think are major issues with this lens. So now that we've got our images in Lightroom, let's take a look at the sharpness and the bokeh. So first, zooming into 1:1, at f2, this lens looks pretty sharp. It's not the sharpest lens I've ever tested, but sharpness is not an area where this lens really falls short. So real quick though, let's compare it to the Sony Zeiss 35mm 1.4 lens. It is a significantly more expensive lens, but nothing really looks sharp or soft until you compare it to something else. So switching over to the 35 at f2, the 35 is quite a bit sharper, but it's also something like 4 or 5 times more expensive. So I think the 28mm is doing really well. So switching back to the 28mm at f2, again, decently sharp. Let's stop down to 2.8. And we get a bit more sharpness. It's looking pretty good. Let's stop down to f4 and it becomes very sharp. So f4 is really good. Let's take a look at f8 and still very sharp. So the sweet spot is somewhere in between f4 and f8. Any higher than f8, you start to suffer sharpness from the effects of diffraction. So now let's take a look at the same images just to take a look at the bokeh. So it is a wide angle that does not have a particularly good minimum focusing distance. So this is not going to be a bokeh king or anything like that, but you can still get some nice results out of this lens. So zoomed all the way out, the bokeh looks pretty nice. Let's zoom in and take a look. It does have this weird swirly effect in the middle. I don't know if that's because my copy is dirty or what's going on, but it is a little bit distracting when you take a closer look at the bokeh. Also, it does have this hard green edge, and it's not particularly round. This bokeh back here, the further away bokeh, is a lot softer, and it is pretty nice, but overall, I'd say it has pretty average bokeh. So stopping down to 2.8, and the bokeh actually gets quite a bit rounder, but it still has this weird swirliness in the middle, and the edge is still pretty harsh. So then let's just take a look at f4. The bokeh at f4, you can start to see the shape of the aperture. Not too bad though, it's still pretty round, and in terms of bokeh and sharpness, this lens is doing really well so far. But now let's talk about something that is an issue with this lens to me. So I turned off the profile correction, and you may not notice because of the way that this shot is lit, but it has a lot of vignetting, and it also has a lot of barrel distortion. So let's click this enable profile correction to see what Lightroom and Sony think about the how they would correct it based on the lens profile. So off versus on, you can see that the vignetting was pretty extreme, and if you keep your eye on the middle, there's quite a bit of that bulge in the middle as you look along these lines of the mug here. So this is where I think the lens sort of starts to fall apart in terms of value for money. I think that a $450 lens should handle these things a little bit better. And this is f2, it's not anything crazy like f1.2, where you would really expect to see these things even in really expensive lenses. So let's do the same thing let's skip f2.8 and go straight to f4. Again, this is still, for f4, this is still quite a bit of vignetting. Let's do the same thing on an APS-C body, where you will see actually quite a bit of a reduction of the vignetting because it's the center crop. It's not filling the entire frame like on a full frame camera body. So here is the lens corrections off and on. And you can still see it is correcting for quite a bit of distortion and quite a bit of vignetting. So in RAW, that's really not that big of a deal. You can correct these things with Lightroom, but if you're shooting video, this is a harder thing to correct. And if you want to share your images straight out of camera, or if you don't want to process them through Lightroom, you will notice these things. And even with the lens correction, let's take a look at, I took this lens with me to China last year, and I did love it as a travel lens, but let's take a look over here. So this is a shot I got, and this is with the corrections turned on, and here it is turned off, and you can really see what it did to this line right here along the road. It distorted it quite a bit, and this is also something where even though you can compensate for vignetting by turning the profile correction on, it raises the edges by a couple of stops. So you start to introduce a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise in the corner because Lightroom had to brighten it by multiple stops. Whereas if you compare it to the middle, even in these shadowy areas, you don't see nearly as much noise because I shot at ISO 800. I did raise it in post by a couple of stops and raise the shadows. So you will introduce some noise, but it's a lot worse here in the corners where Lightroom had to compensate for the vignetting. So that's definitely a huge drawback of this lens, even as a travel lens. For $450, again, that's not the most expensive lens by any means, but I think in this lens, the vignetting and distortion are pretty extreme. So now a quick autofocus test on my A7R III. It seems to be really quick, really responsive, and very accurate. As I focus on the different points, it just snaps right there. So I'd actually give, in terms of autofocus, I would give this lens an A+. So there you have it. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Is this Sony's most underrated lens, or is it kind of a ripoff at 450 bucks? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe.